is Roger Capello bringing you my episode number 53 of my week at the club. This week I had a very hard-fought game against Brett Kildahl on board 1. But before we get into that, I'd like to continue the theme of some of the less obvious astronomy errors in popular science fiction shows. Last week we found that dense asteroid fields may seem ideal for hiding your spaceship, but they just aren't possible in the real universe. Well, this week we're going to do the same for clouds in space.
Captain's log, stardate 43996.2. The Enterprise remains concealed in the dust cloud. And to my surprise, the Borg have maintained their position, waiting for us to come out of hiding.
Such clouds may be great for hiding in, but they're nowhere close to being realistic. Why not? It's true that space does have vast clouds, such as Eta Carinae, an exploding star, or the Orion Nebula, where stars are being born. Another stellar nursery is the Eagle Nebula you see here, which in this region has hot young stars that were recently born, and they blow away gas and dust radially. So you see the more resistant regions, say here, such as the Pillars of Creation, and in this region you have the black pillars. Not as photogenic maybe as those, but equally interesting are the Bach globules, such as Barnard 68. It's a cloud about 500 light years away and only a half light year in diameter, with about 2 solar masses of gas and dust. It's very opaque. You can see that in the photograph. So what's going on? As you look at this photograph of a forest, you can see that the further your line of sight goes, the more likely you are to run into a tree. The same thing happens with water droplets in fog. Further you go, the more likely you hit a water droplet. In the case of an astronomical cloud, one runs into gas molecules or the tiny, tiny grains of silicate or sand that are present in that cloud. And even though they're very far apart, the density of the particles is roughly the same as the density of the particles in space at about the space station's altitude. So you couldn't do much hiding of your ship in that neighborhood vicinity of the space station. The same thing goes true of those clouds. So the trick, why there's an apparent contradiction here, is that the astronomical clouds are very large. The pillars and the Bach globules are about a light year across, and also a similar distance deep along our line of sight. And so they can be made of a very good vacuum, and yet have, when you go through a light year's path on them, it's very likely that your line of sight is going to run into something, and thus it appears opaque to us. So next time you see those clouds being hidden, you'll be able to have an inner chuckle. So on to the chess. So this is my game against Brett Kildahl that I played Wednesday night. And Brett's a national master, currently rated about 2130 or so over 100 points higher than I am. And he has a very good record against me. It's 6.5 or 7 out of 8, better than what our rating differences would predict. And I spent a fair amount of time this week kind of preparing for this game, trying to figure out what opening choice would work best against him. And I decided, since he's such a solid player, I really didn't want to give him any positional weaknesses to work on. So Benoni or Benko Gambit or something like that, where there are clear targets, I decided to stay away from. And instead, I chose the Slav Defense. So this is the second time I've chosen a Slav Defense, I think, in my tournament career, and they were both against Brett. So I'm not sure he's the best person in the world to work out the opening kinks, but I did. So we went into the Slav, and this is a somewhat less ambitious system, keeping the dark squared bishop inside the pawn chain, but it's certainly very solid, in keeping with Brett's style, I think. I should point out that Brett, I see, has already done a video on this game, and I haven't looked at it intentionally before I did my analysis, because I wanted to keep it independent. And I'll look at his video afterward, and I'll link to his video in the description below. And if you want to, you can go and look at that if you haven't done so yet. I'm sure there'll be lots of good material there. So this gives me a chance to get my bishop outside of my pawn chain. Development goes on. I finish my pawn triangle, and he challenges my bishop on the light square diagonal. I came up with an idea that I think was okay, which is to lure the bishop away by exchanging off the pawns. I wasn't afraid at this point of him playing bishop takes bishop. I took a little while to analyze this, but the point is that he'll have to work a bit to get his pawn back again that's on c4. And even though I don't have a E or D pawn, I do control some crucial squares here in the center with my pawns, especially right now with that pawn on c4. So, I felt this would be playable for me, and he must have too, because he chose not to go into that line. Instead, he just took the pawn that I offered, which is a kind of a diversion. Gives me time to develop my knight. He castled, and I developed my bishop to e7. Now, when I did this, I realized that d6 was a more active, putting it on a more active diagonal here, pointed at his king side. But I was already looking at some tactical ideas having to do with an open D file, and so I decided not to clutter the D file. But I think this is probably not the optimal square for the bishop. Let me scroll a bit for you. After he brought his bishop back to d3, there's that tactical idea I mentioned, which doesn't quite work right now, and that's that I could take the bishop, and he has to recapture with the queen, and then because of the pin along the d file, I could actually play my knight to c5, attacking the queen, which looks good, but the problem is queen just drops back, and then I have I can't go, I'd like to sink my knight into e4, but he has that square attacked twice, his queen and knight, and once my knight moves there, I only have one piece controlling it. So I'd lose a piece if I went there. And I would have nothing better than to drop my knight back to d7. There aren't any good squares for it to continue on to. So this wasn't a good idea, but I was hoping that maybe I would be able to reinforce, to put this plan into action before he asked the question with bishop to d3. So he did play bishop to d3. I chose not to trade them off because I didn't want the queen recapturing on d3 and just getting into a more aggressive attacking position, eyeing up h7, and if his knight goes to g5, then I start to feel a fair bit of pressure there. The other thing is that after the queen captures on d3, he's immediately threatening pawn to e4. That's threatening the current position, and I realize that, but I decided that there really wasn't anything I could do about it. So I went ahead and castled, and he played e4 as I expected. And then I had a choice of moving my pawn to either g4 or, oops, that's not g4. Let's try that again. G4 or g6. On g6, it tends to neutralize his light squared bishop, but at some point it will come under attack by his knight out to h4, I believe. Anyhow, I chose to play it to g4, and on that square then I could, by pinning that knight to his queen, I could weaken his control of e5. And so even if he plays e5, I could hope to counterattack the pawn on e5 at some point. I thought too long about this move. I spent about 8 minutes, and this game really came down to time pressure, and I wish I hadn't spent as much time as I did on some of the moves that really, when you look at the eval, you know, are only a tenth or 2/10 of a pawn different in terms of eval, and I was really splitting hairs. They weren't really important moves. If I'd played bishop to g6, you know, the play might have gone something. Well, actually, it wouldn't have gone like this. This line that I highlighted. I had thought he might play the knight out to h4, but this actually, of course, isn't a good move because of the discovered attack on that knight. Because I can just take on e4 and win a pawn in the process. And if he takes back, then I take the knight. And if you do a body count, I'm a pawn ahead. So he would not have done that. Okay, so instead, he played bishop to g5, and I was really glad to see that, because during the game, I felt that the crucial move here for him in this position was going to be to move his pawn to e5 and drive my knight away from its defensive post on f6. I really didn't like the look of that. And instead, he played the bishop to g5, and that now gives me time to prevent him from playing e5 by doing it myself. If he takes, I'll just take back with my knight. Instead, he played bishop takes on f6, and without even, you know, thinking very long about it, I recaptured with my bishop because I felt my knight was more or less tied down to the defense of this pawn on e5. But that was sloppy analysis, really. And if you look at this line for a moment of what happens if I take on f6 with my knight, which the computer pointed out to me, then he can capture the pawn on e5, but he can't hold on to it. I can play knight to d7, and I'll win it back. And he could push it, I suppose, and counter-sacrifice it back to me. Or the other possibility is to break the pin on his knight, so that after I trade, his pin knight is not coming under a double attack, I guess is the best way to look at that, to say it. Okay, but I did take back with the bishop. And now that after he pushes his pawn, this bishop looks kind of stupid. In fact, I have the bishop pair that I won as a result of his maneuver, but my bishops in this game really aren't very good, as you'll see. In particular, this bishop on g4 becomes a real lemon. Okay, so I played knight to c4 at this point, the idea being to drive away his bishop, and then after his bishop moved to c2, I was going to play a5 and sink my knight in there on c5 on kind of a good post. He didn't give me time to do that, though. Instead, he played b4 immediately, which allows me to get a second bishop. But this is actually turning into a good position for him because his knights will become active and my bishops won't. I blockaded the pawn with my queen, which is never a good sign if you have to do that. But at least I'm gaining a little bit of time here by attacking that b pawn, and I felt I'd get a tempo. And I did. He took the time out to defend that pawn, which gave me time then to double up on the d file and start to threaten maybe to tear apart his pawn center. So he played knight to d2 at this point. I was kind of, looking at this position right here and hoping that I could retreat my bishop at some point to e6 to bring another attack onto this pawn and make use of the fact that the d pawn is pinned along the file to be able to bring my bishop onto that square. It turns out I wasn't able to do that. So instead, he played knight to d2. And in this position, after knight to d2, the principal threat, of course, is to attack my queen with the knight. I didn't want to let his knight to come in strongly like that, So I played what looks like an anti-positional pawn move, but I don't think it was because, well, let me move back. Oops. It leaves me, scroll this up a bit here. It leaves me with that backwards C pawn on C6, but no, that's not C6. Right there. Okay. My idea was to first of all protect this weak pawn on B5 with my A pawn, right? And then after I do that, that's not what I meant to do. I'm having a little trouble with my arrows and things today. Just to move up like that. And then after I protected this pawn so that it's safe from being taken by his knight, then to trade off my C pawn probably for his D pawn, or possibly to advance it. But I didn't want to give him a protected passed pawn. He, I guess, sensed some of this coming and immediately got off of the file. And meanwhile is attacking my A pawn, which with his queen, so I don't really want to lose this guy, and so I played him up. It's not clear that it's much of a threat. Oh, let's go back there. Not much of a threat because sometimes taking that A pawn, is just inviting something like Rook A8. But I wanted to support the B pawn anyhow because his knight has it under attack, and I wanted to get my C pawn here mobile. Okay, he played his knight to B3, threatening to come into this good square here on C5. And the thing about this move, though, is that he's momentarily shielding his B pawn from the defense of the rook. And so I thought for, again, too long, and I had various possibilities about whether or not I could afford to take that pawn, and I eventually decided that I could. And it turns out that it's an okay thing to do, but it's not great, but it's not bad either. And it's fairly neutral. He took back on C6. I think if he had played instead knight to C5, which is the main move I was worried about, this actually is worse for him because I can come to D4 and eventually force a queen trade. After he takes the pawn, I take his queen, and then I'm going to round up that pawn on C6 anyhow. And this actually is significantly better for black. Not winning, but over a pawn advantage. So instead, in this position, he took the C pawn, and the thing is, though, is that I can win it back by retreating my queen. And I didn't really think he could make this move, defending the pawn with his knight, because of my answer, which attacks that knight, and there's no way to defend the knight. He has to move it, and he came in further with it, and now my rook, that invites my rook to take up a very active post on D4. And he still has this weak pawn on C6, so I thought that this would be bad for him. It turned out it wasn't so bad. I think he saw through a little better than I did. He's able to get his knight into on this beautiful post on D5, so he's forking my queen and my bishop. I need to do something about that, but fortunately I have something very nice to do, which is to take that pawn. Now I'm, at least for a little while here, a pawn ahead. It's true, he can fall back and attack my queen, but then I have to figure out where to go to. And I didn't like, it seemed like wherever I went to, there were possibilities for his knight to be hassling my queen. And if I were to stick around at all on the C file, for the rooks to attack my queen on the C file. So he's getting pretty active play here. And so I decided either, that I wanted, that I didn't want him to open up my king's position and then maybe win my bishop by playing queen to G3 and pinning the bishop along the G file. So I decided to keep my queen where I could recapture on f6 with my queen, and then it was a question of going to d6 or e6. I went to e6, and I think actually d6 would have been a bit better. At least on d6, it's true I could have been attacked by his knight again, but I could have just repeated the position. Actually, that's not quite a repeat. I could have gone to c7, repeated the position, and then when he goes back and attacks me, then I could just play back to d6 and say, well, you want to draw? That's probably an okay result in this game. Certainly, since he's giving away some rating points if we play a draw. Instead, I went to e6, and one problem with that is that restricts the mobility here of my bishop now, my light-squared bishop coming back, and you'll see what happens then a few moves from now. So he played his rook to the c file, and I, without thinking perhaps enough, of course I was starting to get short on time already, I wanted to try to neutralize the rook on the c file. I didn't want to give the c file away, and I went ahead and played rook to c8. What the computer likes, and is actually a move that I looked at here and a couple of other places, was to sack my rook for the knight on d5. And it's actually quite a reasonable exchange sack. If I take that knight on d5, he takes back, and I take the pawn. I'm now, if you count up as a rook and, or rather a rook versus knight in two pawns. Let's check that. Say that again. It's his rook for my bishop in two pawns, and I have a bishop for a knight. But anyhow, so it's a minor piece plus two pawns. Material would be even, and it's actually it's not a bad position at all for black. And it really gets rid of that monster knight on d5 and cuts down on his attacking possibilities. I think if I had the game to play again, I would very much like to do that. Instead, after he came over to c1, I opposed him with my rook. And the problem is that he doesn't have to exchange right away. He can drive my bishop off of that diagonal, which he does, and then he exchanges. And now my bishop's in a poor place, and he, whenever he wants to, he could probably play knight takes bishop, pawn takes, injuring, harming my pawn structure in front of my king. So after he did that, he took time to, with his other rook, to get onto the c file to try to regain it. I played my queen to d7. And that allows, after rook to d7, puts my queen in a bit of a pickle. I'm starting to run out of squares, and I haven't, but I spent all my time looking at what squares to go to and what would be safe and what wouldn't be safe. And I got down to 6 minutes in the game, and I said, I have to make a move. This is too complicated. If I just find a square for my queen, he's going to attack it again with one of his knights, and I just don't have time to be looking out for all the various forking possibilities or direct attacks on it. And I got a little impatient, and even though I knew it was probably a bad move, I went ahead and then played rook takes knight, which is now, of course, is a queen sack. After rook takes queen, rook takes rook. I've traded a queen for a rook and a bishop, plus the original pawn. Material's about even, but I have this dummy bishop on a5. After the game, Brett pointed out something that I missed that he saw after he made his move, that I had time for for one move, I had time to actually win with rook d1 check, and that would have swung the eval from around +1 or so that it's been hanging at to -7. And he plays king up, and I thought, when I looked at it, I thought that I had nothing special going on, and that my rook would be undefended there, and my queen has to move. But what I didn't see, of course, is that I could check with the bishop, and now if he plays his best move, which is king to e2, I could check him. He has to move, and then I play queen takes rook. And if he takes back my queen, I take his queen, and he takes, and the bishop skewers the two knights. Nice little combination there. And if he doesn't do it, what looked at me like would have been the main move, which would have been to have a tempo winner here with g3, and now I've got both my queen and my bishop on prise. Thing is I can play queen to h3, and he doesn't have time really to take this bishop because my queen is coming in with a deadly check, or rook. I mean, it's just a or queen takes on h2 check, which in this position would be checkmate. So it's this would be very bad for white, very good for black. I didn't do it, unfortunately, and instead I traded that rook for the I traded my queen for the knight and the rook. Let's see. So after I did that, he played his knight in, tying my bishop down to the defense of the e-pawn, and also putting his knight on a more centralized square. I decided to get rid of the back rank mate threats that have been lurking around. The main problem is I have to figure out some way to develop this bishop here, and it wasn't easy to do. He played queen to b3, which is an interesting move. It it keeps me from moving this f pawn. I want to move my bishop somehow without losing the my e pawn, and then after I do, play f6 and then move the light squared bishop out. It's a real little Chinese block puzzle here, moving my pieces around. Not what you want to have. So what I did was to go up and attack his knight first. He moved it back. That gave me time, now that my pawn is no longer under attack, it gives me time to reposition my dark squared bishop. Also thinking, wanting to get it on a better diagonal here where it's looking at the white king. But it does give him time to get on that super square d5. And that is really a monster knight now on d5. So then I'm able to play my king to h7 because that pawn will no longer be pinned to my king. His queen moves because it doesn't really do much on that diagonal anymore. And I have time to play my pawn up, which is what I wanted to do. But unfortunately now his queen and knight are going to be very strong infiltrating around my pieces, and I just have a hard time coordinating them. He attacks my rook. I wanted to keep it on the third rank so I could defend my pawn. He comes down and attacks the bishop, and now he's attacking both my rook and this pawn over here on a6. So I want the way to defend it is move my rook to d6. Now he can attack that rook, but fortunately I can go to d7 and still defend my bishop. Then this move, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it because it attacks that pawn, and I really don't have much better to do than to just go back to where I was on d6, defending it. I want to get time if I can to get my light squared bishop into the game. He played his queen back to b8, so a little repetition here. Attacked my rook. Again, I went back to d6. And this time he tried something different, going to c5, attacking the rook. But it's still under attack. I went back and defended my pawn. And I was starting to think that maybe I had a fortress here, and getting a little hopeful, but with very little time to be making these moves, and they had to be precise. But he brought his king out, which is a good move, improved the position of his king, and said, well, what am I going to do to improve my position? And, I was hoping that I would get the time to play that bishop to b6 at some point where it wouldn't be traded off by his knight and skewer his queen. But of course that wasn't about to happen with Brett. So I played my bishop to f7, but it's not defended there. It's not the ideal square, and as a result, queen f8 doesn't win it immediately, because I do actually, after this, have this shielding move here. But after another innocuous pawn move, preparing things, I have to do something. I played my rook to e8, which is a mistake, because then he attacks that rook and my pawn, and if I go up to defend the pawn, then he can go to d7 and attack two pieces at once here. He's forking my bishop and my rook, and I could go down and, well, actually it's worse than that. He's attacking three pieces at once. Three undefended pieces. Well, the rook is defended, but if the bishop moves, then the rook is no longer defended. There's no way at this point, I believe, to actually save everything. And what's worse is, I made it just about an instant move here, and with 1 second on the clock, I stopped the clock and resigned, because rather than just run out of time, I felt he deserved my resignation here in this game. So it was well played by Brett. He had that one little glitch where I had the possible counterattack by getting down to this point here, where I could have come down and come in with a nice attack against him. But that was a fleeting moment, and other than that, most of the time he played pretty well. I felt like I played well too. It was the eval kind of swung around plus and minus around zero quite a bit, and it wasn't until I really got in time pressure later on where things got really dicey. So congratulations to Brett for going 5-0 this month and winning the Reggie Boone Memorial. And I only had 3.5 out of 5 because I had that draw earlier against Ken Gurge. So next month or next week is a new tournament, and get to see how I do in that one. So long for now.